before we, you want, I better show you this real quick. I'm following, the Supreme Court where they're literally doing a case that might change elections forever. If state legislatures can basically decide everything about an election, if they don't like the outcome of an election, they can overturn it. That's being ruled right now in the Supreme Court. So the independent legislative, figure. If they don't like the outcome of the election. So that's what they're ruling right now.
So basically, if their party is.
Yes. Or they can bring it to help their party. Yeah, this is a big deal. Before we get to that though, let's watch something else. You want to see the luckiest? This is still the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Okay, watch this. All right, control. And perfectly fine. That's the normal way to draw. We got to have one more time. Hit that. Hit a bus, and then. The legislature would vote, yeah, in the legislature. Yeah, it's a really big deal. So they could bring up legislative districts and help their party even more than they do now, called gerrymandering. We'll get to that later. But yeah, this is a huge deal, basically saying that your vote doesn't matter if the legislature can throw it on. This is like, wow. That whole democracy thing, yeah. You know, we've tried it. And the conservatives on the court, 4 of them want it. So it's a big deal. This is really big. We might be a radically different country in 6 months. The Supreme Court is ruling right now on whether or not state legislators can overthrow federal law. So basically, say the voters for that, we don't like it. This is a big, wow, this is a big deal. Wow. Well, if they get everybody they want, and if certain party gets everybody they want there, they'll certainly be able to get a lot done. Yeah.
So like, if we're not in the states, like the president, but one state doesn't like it, does that overturn?
No, it's just inside that election. But remember, like for electoral votes, remember the mini elections inside the state. And basically what it's saying is they can go back and say, you know, that was fraudulent, we're gonna throw it out. Yeah, there was talk of that in 2020, about doing that in some states, and I don't know. 5 years ago, I would have said, no way they would destroy democracy, but I don't know now. I don't know. We better get to the Civil War because I'm very disturbed by this. The state legislature.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, but once you get down that road of overturning elections, it becomes easy to overturn other ones. This is a big deal. This is a really big deal. And there's a lot of really big deals. This is the most radical time I've ever seen the court. And I've been around for over 200 years. What skincare? Just clean living. 4 to 5 pounds of vitamin C a day.
Well, you said 30 pounds, so.
Well, wait a minute, 30 pounds. That's
30 to 40.
I must have vitamin B. All right, so can we get to this habeas corpus?
Yeah.
Oh, DBQ. So I got most of the DBQs ready. People are doing wow. And yeah, a few things here and there. A couple of people have to make it up. We'll get to that, and hopefully I'll have them all done tomorrow. They just take a long time to grade. I grade a few, but I have to go through and make sure you have the documents. And you have a few documents, people kind of summarize and did relate it to the thesis. That's pretty common. You know, just send, we'll do a few more. And, but I was pleased. Secondly, I must remind you, I'm going to give you homework over Christmas break. It's not that bad. You have to copy the. That'll help you so much.
Yeah, so helpful.
No, we gotta do a little bit of reading and a couple other things. I would prefer not to give you homework. Because it's a pain for me too. But we have to be done by May 5th. That's when the AP exam is. We just have no choice. But as luck would have it, the vigilante parade is on that day. Yay! So what I'm gonna do is this. I will put it up at the end of next week. And so you'll get, if anyone's gonna be gone, I'll have it up by, I'll try to get it by next Wednesday. By then I should know pretty much where we're gonna be, so I'll have it up. It'll be one DBQ. No, you're not doing the whole DBQ. You're gonna have to go through the documents, organize it. And it's just a practice. We're not doing the whole DBQ, we just practice one, a little bit of reading. And I will give you another chance for extra credit. Okay? Yes. We have to be in pretty good detail on everything through 1980. And then after 1980, there's certain things I will make you know. But we don't need as much detail, but just the way they structure the test. And then that's what we do after the test. For like the first week and a half, I'll kind of finish up any loose ends as close as we can. It's hard to do really modern history because we don't have any context, any perspective. You know, our personal views kind of taint, but we can still do a little bit of it. And then after that, it's nothing but fitness. Running, time miles, wall sits, trench digging. We'll do trench digging, and then you know, there's hole in the trench. There's dirt in my trench. You have to dig it out. You know, and then you fill it in. The next day we'll dig another one. When I say we, I mean you. Does everyone have a good shovel? And you're leaving? Yes. I would do a couple. Yeah. We'll get to it. All right. Did we get to this? Do we get habeas corpus, Lincoln?
Yeah.
Yeah, Lincoln said, why should we follow the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court should not override democracy. Which is so interesting because that's literally, all right. It's just so fascinating to me. In a scary, terrifying way. So, did we get to this? Okay, so we got Butler. So Butler was in this little fort right here. So right here, Virginia seceded, but the US kept a military installation here called Fort Monroe, right here on the James Peninsula. And the Confederates couldn't push them out. All of a sudden, all of these former slave or runaway slaves, remember they're called fugitives, people running away to freedom, started showing up at Fort Monroe. These fugitives. And Butler, originally the order was, you're going to return fugitives away according to the Constitution. Well, Butler said this Massachusetts politician who was given the generalship because he was such a prominent Democrat, Lincoln's trying to get Democrats to support the war. Here's Butler. One of the most wily politicians in American history. What's a joke? Crossed eyes and mixed motives. Yes, his eyes were crossed. One of those things. But he said, wait a second. You okay? All right. Wait a second. If I return these slaves to their owners, that helps the Confederacy. So they should be kept as, and he called it, this cartoon shows it right here, contraband of war, or soon they're just, these fugitives are going to be known for the rest of the war as contrabands. Because why return them? They're going to help the war effort. And so the United States would feed and clothe them. Some would be sent north. They would be used as laborers. They would not be really given their freedom, but better than slavery. It's one of those weird gray areas. But once it came out that contrabands of war, and Lincoln's like, yeah, right. It became the little trickle of runaways turned into a flood. And every place for the rest of the war, at least for the next 2 years before emancipation, it's going to be all these, wherever Union armies would march in the South, slaves would run away for their freedom and for equality. And this is eventually going to lead to a massive pool of men determined to fight for the United States. I guess where that's going. So Contrabands of War. Butler was no free soiler even. But he understood the situation quite well. And then, so here are a few of the contrabands. And just that's what they're called then. And here are slaves running away to Fort Monroe. And this really did help undermine the Confederate war effort and brought their idea, look at what Northerners are doing. Even though, remember, Lincoln is saying over and over again, the war is about union. And so let's get them, as this is happening, troops are showing up in Washington, D.C. Both sides have a volunteer army. They had to turn away recruits, which later on in the war, they would kind of regret that. Some were only 90-day recruits, thinking the war would end very quickly. A lot of young men joined so they could, originally in some states it was 19, some 18, but they joined at 17 or 16 so they would not miss out on the fun. There were very few trained soldiers, so they elected their officers, elected their sergeants. They're reading out of drill books written basically based upon Napoleon's army, and they're reading how to march. I mean, it's just in both sides, but the Confederates have a slight advantage. Remember, they have those militias. And lots of patriotic pictures like this. Every state would have, they get a quota, and the quota would be how many regiments they must muster. So like this is to volunteer for a New York regiment, the Manhattan Rifles. Here, very common to go into like where they have a lot of Irish immigrants and join with all your fellow countrymen. This was actually kind of a big deal because Irish immigrants, a lot of them were treated as second-class citizens, treated as inferior even in New York, and they were fearful if they helped free slaves, which even though the war wasn't about that, everyone kind of thought it might be, they might lose their status. And so a couple of very prominent Irish politicians would be really important to recruit Irish soldiers. I should add, that's one of the Irish, an Irish regiment. I got that at Antietam, the battlefield there. And soon to be a brigade of Irish soldiers called the Irish Brigade. One of those prominent New York politicians who was a fighter for Irish freedom, condemned, arrested, escaped to the United States, whose name was Thomas Francis Meagher. Have you heard of Thomas Francis Meagher? Who knows this is the capital of Holland? Did you know that? And what about the capital is Meagher, you know? Yeah, the big statue of Meagher, which was a big slap in the face to the pro-Confederate vigilantes. We'll get to that down the road. So with that, and I'm talking to you, he's telling them, okay, moving on. And so here are Confederate soldiers who rallied. Some had militia uniforms of all kinds of colors. Some had red, some had blue, some had gray, all kinds of colors of militia uniforms, but most of them were whatever clothes they had. They really didn't have the industry. They had to turn away soldiers too, but Confederate forces, and remember the population. There were over 22 million people in the North. There's only 9 million in the South, and 4 million of those are slaves. By definition, they can't arm the slaves. I think we all understand why. And so that means the Confederates only have 5 million people. How many men of military age do they have then? Yeah, I mean, even if you're going basically 17 to 50, that's only 1.5 million. And so they're always going to have smaller armies, but they have those militias, and they would soon go to this mountain valley. And here are Confederate regiments rallying. And some states didn't send them. Georgia, North Carolina, Georgia especially, like, nah, we're not going to send that many. Only a few regiments from Georgia, states' rights. North Carolina, too. North Carolina's going to get a really bad reputation of not only not sending soldiers, but their soldiers being cowards. In fact, the only way to make them stand is you had to put tar on their heels so they would not go on and play. Have you ever heard of the motto of North Carolina? They would take that to be tar so we don't run away. Not that we keep us from running away. That's why they're called the Tar Heel State. They try to turn it into a compliment. That happens a lot, Yankees. So with that, well, everyone thought there's going to be one big battle. And Lincoln is pushing the commander of Union forces, stop, to do something, attack, attack, attack. And Scott makes a good point. Our army is not ready. And it's a lot harder to attack than defend. You have to come out, you have to march, you have to maneuver. You need a lot better trained soldiers. And Lincoln's like, they're untrained to attack. One big battle. Remember, every war, they think one big battle won the war. And the Confederates are thinking the same thing. We win one big battle. The Union will realize we mean business, and the United States, well, quit. I should almost ask them. I don't even know I'm doing this, but the United States is also the North. So sometimes I refer to them as US, sometimes as the North, and not even realize I'm doing it. Or the Union, I just do it. Sometimes they're also called the Federals, for the federal government, and I might call them the Federals and not realize I'm doing it. Or I might say the Blue. I'm so used to it, I don't even think about it. So everyone got when I say that. It's technically the United States. That's the North. The South, you might be the Confederates. Sometimes I'll call them rebels, sometimes gray, sometimes the South. And don't forget, when I say the South, it's not all the South. There are a lot of people who didn't want to leave the Union. And don't forget, there's 4 million slaves. And there's no doubt who they wanted. So, and there are some pro-Confederate Northerners too. Well, the Confederates try to build like some forts up here, but those aren't really built yet. Everybody knew the fight's going to be here. One big battle. The capital of the Confederacy is now Richmond. They thought one big battle here. And so at that, we're coming to the first major battle of the war. It's really this confusing battle called Bull Run or Manassas. And the cry for the Union forces onto Richmond. So the thought was we destroy them in front of Richmond. And everybody said it's a 90-day war. And I just emphasize again, Lincoln is pushing. Scott didn't want this. He said, give me 2 more months. But Lincoln is saying, do it now. Also, Congress is not in session yet. So Lincoln wants to do it before he has Congress bugging. And the thought was in the North, the Confederates are a bunch of hayseeds we could beat, or they're a bunch of drunkards and we'll just run them out of here. Now, why did this battle have 2 names? Well, the Union named their battle after the nearest waterway. There's a little meandering creek called Bull Run. Run means creek. Thus is the Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates named their battle after the nearest village or town. There was a railway junction there called Manassas Junction. So the Battle of Manassas. So you'll see a lot of these battles called Bull Run or Manassas. You really see it like in the South. Both Southern thinks it's Manassas. North is Bull Run. And as luck would have it, there'll be another battle fought on this exact same spot a year later. So this is the first Bull Run. There'll also be a second Bull. Both sides, roughly in that area, had about 35,000 men. The Union command, here's the Grand Army, a drawing of it on the way to march south and to defeat the Confederates. This is a map from this era. And here's Richmond. Really good map, isn't it? Once again, I'm in awe of how good a map maker is. But here's Washington. And the plan was to march down the railroad towards Richmond. Here's Manassas Junction. There are about 20,000 soldiers there under the Confederates. Remember Beauregard from Sumter? And then another Confederate commander here with about 12,000. But he's going to move this way. So both sides had about 35,000. The Union commander, Scott is too old. He is so infirmed and he had gained so much weight in the last 10 years, he couldn't mount his horse anymore. They had to come up with like this winch and pulley system to get on the horse. So needless to say, he can't go into combat. Irwin McDowell was considered very competent, and he was there. And so they gave it to McDowell. He's the first commander. See the hat? These are keepings. Everybody copies the French when it comes to the military. Everybody copies the French. And so you see all these things, French uniforms, French hats, French style of march. And that's where baseball caps are from. French keepings. You can thank the French for your saddle mariner. McDowell was nothing special. McDowell's like, we're not ready to go, but you're ordered to do it. There's actually 2 Confederate commanders, Beauregard, and then maybe one of the more competent generals of the war, Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston is coming with reinforcements. Beauregard is there. Davis hated Beauregard. Beauregard was obnoxious, arrogant. I know everybody who's a general is going to be shockingly arrogant, but he was unusually arrogant. The other thing is, I just like saying the name Beauregard. I mean, you got to admit that is a pretty good name. Beauregard. I can't really do a Southern accent, but if I could, it's perfect. That's it, the perfect name. Well, to watch the fun, all of these spectators came from Washington, D.C., members of Congress, their families, cabinet members, wealthy people. They took their wagons, brought picnic lunches, and went down to watch the fun and watch the soldiers. Watch the U.S. rout those rebels and end the war right there. Who wants to miss the fun of having people suffer and die in front of them? They thought it was all romantic, and they went out and they parked around Bull Run Creek and had a picnic and watched it, like it was a spectator sport. Well, McClellan's plan was pretty simple. Here's Bull Run Creek, a couple bridges over here. Confederate lines are here. He would start an attack here, but it's just a fake. His main force would go around the flank and hit the Confederates in the rear. It's a good plan, except for the fact with raw soldiers, they're not really good at the march, but it almost worked. It almost did. Here are Union soldiers with the painting a little bit after the fact on the run. Remember the Confederate flag right here, the stars and bars. And they began to advance around the Confederates. The Confederates saw them come this way, and they ran. They were untrained too. And within an hour, it looked like the war was over. I mean, literally, Confederates are running away. In fact, it was so obvious that Union forces stopped to pick up souvenirs. They didn't want to say, I'm going to remember the battle. And they would stop, kind of posing, relaxing. The lines got out of whack. Units got mixed up. And they advanced near a hill called Henry Hill. Now, Henry Hill was a Confederate regiment under the command of a very weird guy by the name of Thomas Jackson. West Point, he was commander of it. He was a teacher at Virginia Military Institute. He commanded a regiment, about 600 men. And they stood on this hilltop. This is a monument. Near that, this is the monument on the hill. Union forces had to advance up it. And he stood and held that hill. And another general named B looked to his men, and the story is, to rally his men, said, don't run away. Look, there's Jackson standing there like a stone wall, meaning don't run away. They're standing. And the legend is this broke the Union advance and stopped them right there. It could have also been an insult. B could have been saying, there's Jackson like a stone wall not coming to our aid. We don't know because B died 2 weeks later in another small battle. But the legend would grow. And thus he's going to be known for the rest of the war. And to this day, it's Stonewall Jackson. And one of Lee's most dynamic, or one of the South's most dynamic commanders, known to be very aggressive, but also really weird. Sometimes his forces would attack and do these great maneuvers. Sometimes he would, these 7 days battles, he would take a nap under a tree and his men would just sit there. Just got tired, took it out. He would ride into battle with one arm raised to keep his blood equalized. He was just a very odd man. I would say crazy, but let's not quite go there. But he would become one of the most famous Confederate commanders. Just as they stopped behind the Union advance, remember, they're all now just confusing battles. They all got done and discombobulated. Here come men in blue rushing behind them. They thought it was reinforcements. They got to 20 yards and they opened fire. It was a regiment from Virginia or from Louisiana. It was militia, and they had blue uniforms. So they thought they were Union forces. That led to the panic. Just then, Confederate reinforcements under Johnston arrived by train down here and were able to attack. Train would become a big deal. They knew locomotives would be important, but this would change war forever. You could move so many more supplies and therefore have bigger armies. You could move men faster. Much of this war then is going to be about transportation, rail lines or rivers. Can you move? And so advances have to be on rail lines, or they're going to be short because you'll run out of supplies. Industrialization will change everything. World War I, it's all about trains. And in World War II, the whole gist of the war, about so many reasons, is going to be about one thing when it comes to transportation. Oil. Today's the anniversary of what? The Japanese attack at a US naval base in the colony of the Hawaiian Islands. Why did they attack Pearl Harbor? They just assumed the United States would bail out and would not stop their effort to take the oil they needed. And where was the oil? Which is then the colony of, yeah, the Dutch colony. They figured the United States would just bail out. If they attacked our main Pacific fleet, which is in the colony of Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. It didn't work that way. And then 2 days later, Germany, for reasons no one really understands, except for the fact that Hitler, they declared war on the United States. And that's how we got into World War II. But back to this. They counterattacked, and the Union retreat turned into a rout. And men began to run away. It became a disaster. Confederate cavalry, when they had much more experienced horsemen, got behind the Union line, and it turned into a disaster. And when they got to those spectators who went from yay, cheering and waving their handkerchiefs, they panicked. And some of their wagons got stuck on 2 of the bridges, which made the panic even worse. Thus, the panic turned into, I love this name, the Great Skedaddle. They just all ran north as fast as they could go. In fact, they ran to 20 miles to Washington, D.C., and some just kept going. We're done. It should remind you of the Bladensburg races in the War of 1812. The only reason the Confederates did not take Washington, D.C., they were just as disorganized in victory, and they couldn't get their men lined up. That saved the capital. If they could have taken it by storm before the Union forces could get reorganized, who knows? Probably would have ended. Politically, it would have been such a disaster. Who knows? And there shows a little bit of the runaway. Yes, a horrible. Now, what's a casualty? Killed, wounded, or missing. Missing means taken prisoner or deserted. That means they can't fight anymore. Whenever they say casualties, most people think those killed, but it's all 3. In the war, Civil War, for every one person killed in combat, there's going to be 3 to 4 women. Today, it's about in the United States Army in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the United States invaded there and joined that Civil War in Afghanistan. It was about 1 out of 15. For every one person killed, there's 15. And so we over 7,000 American soldiers, American men and women died in American men died in combat. That means 125,000 wounded. That's in the last one. Here, yeah. Okay, I'm going to tell you the casualties. Now, I'm not going to make you know the numbers. I'm just trying to give you an idea how bloody this thing was. Both sides had about 35,000 men, and both sides had about 2,500 casualties. And people were just appalled. They could not believe that. 2,500, so that means 500 killed on each side. I mean, they just couldn't, 700 killed on each side. And they just couldn't wrap their mind around those numbers. If you know anything about the Civil War, that's just a drop in. It's going to get so horrible. And the big thing about this war, this battle, it proved one thing. It's going to take more than one big battle. It's going to be a long war. And that's what we got to get, a long war. I should add, how long of a war? It might last a year. No one could dream how awful it's going to be. Nobody could imagine. I should add, we can't. We can't wrap our mind around nearly 1 million people dying. Think about 1 million people out of 31 million. Multiply that by, about 12 today. So just imagine 12 million people dying. I don't know. Of course, 1.5 million died of COVID, and we have not come to grips with that either. So here's one mocking an American soldier trying to hide in a farm. Here's a British one saying how they went to take Canada. They ran north and just kept going to take Canada, which is kind of funny. The British are like, the Americans are done. Lincoln's running an insane asylum. Oh, no, don't worry about Buck Buchanan. I'm sorry, that wasn't supposed to be there. So back to Scott. So fortunately, Washington DC did not fall. And Winfield Scott now has command, he's still in command. And Lincoln's already decided, one thing about it, Scott was right. And did that make Lincoln go, you are so right, I should listen to you? No, what did Lincoln think? I didn't want to admit how wrong I was. I'm about ready to fire Scott. It's shocked how many times if you're right, you get no reward. If you don't believe me, look how many people are in politics who have been and still have major positions, and they've been wrong and failures, and they're still there. Or since I follow sports, how many coaches or managers have been absolute disasters and they're still around. So it's amazing how they just keep rewarding these people who are wrong. Don't you do it. So Scott now, and Scott did have a plan, and the plan will be dubbed the Anaconda. Now what it's going to be is a plan to slowly strangle the South. First up, attack Richmond in the heartland of the Confederacy. Secondly, take the Mississippi River, cutting the Confederacy in two. And then the most important part, blockade the South so they can't get supplies. Remember King Cotton diplomacy. So it's going to be like a very slow fight. This is implying a long war. Lincoln didn't want to hear that. Lincoln wanted the war over. But now they're going to have to kind of accept this. So it's going to be a slow strangulation of the South, and somebody said like a snake, and they called it the Anaconda Plan, even though anacondas don't do that necessarily, but the slow strangulation. So that, he didn't call it that at first. It meant that was supposed to be like an insult. It would become the name. Here's those little caricatures of all the various states, and they're kind of hard to see, but I do love Alabama. Just some guy going, Alabama. Okay, so with that, Lincoln, desperate for somebody who had success, ordered Scott to appoint a general, only 34 years old, who won a small little victory in what's soon going to be West Virginia. Just a minor little fight over a pass by the name of George McClellan. But he won a victory. McClellan was a West Point graduate. He resigned after the war. He was a manager of the Illinois Central Railroad. So Lincoln really thought, okay, this young, dynamic man, not the old fossil, Scott. And he sounded smart, sounded like a general, looked the part, looked very commanding. He was shockingly arrogant. Said he could make this army, make it great, and they basically said, you command this mob in Washington, D.C. They literally had to go through the bars in Washington, D.C. and root the soldiers out who ran away. That's how bad it was after the Bull Run. And McClellan began to organize the army and turn this mob into maybe the greatest army in American history. Trained them, drilled them, got them better supplies. They did these grand reviews and they would cheer McClellan as he would ride by. There's all these pictures of him waving his hat. They cheer and cheer. They wrote songs about him. He's followed by his immense staff, just like Napoleon. And he built this incredible army. And the men loved him for it. They felt like a mob. And then in a month, they became Little Mac's army. It meant something for the rest of the war. And the army that would lead the United States to victory would be McClellan's army. He was an amazing organizer. And he would dub this army, this is the one, Rivers, remember the Union did Rivers, the Army of Potomac. And eventually 100,000 men as more recruits came in. You might think Bull Run they lost, might lead to fewer recruits. No, more men immediately joined saying, okay, let's rout them now. Of course, the problem is they're only in 2-year hitches. A lot of them will be getting out just in time for this other battle called Gettysburg. But that's another story down the road. Here's the entire 100,000 man army of the Potomac. My favorite part about this picture is they're by height. Doesn't he look about 3'1"? But he's got an awesome mustache. No.
Oh.
There's 100,000 men, but that's just one platoon. But you can see how they're uniformed: navy blue, royal blue pants, teepee hat. What's the uniform made out of? Very comfortable wool. And wool is really good in the hot, humid climate of Virginia because wool keeps the heat out. That's science. And so next time that's a really hot day, put on a parka. You will thank me. Now, the Confederates had whatever they could grab, so these were better in the winter, but still. They were pretty tough back then. They just kind of accepted it. Yeah,
I mean, how was so much cotton?
you have to have textile. South didn't have it. They had, remember, almost all the mills are in the north. Now, why do they use wool? It lasts. Cotton is relatively thin. You can wear that uniform and go through. And that's why you see, by World War I and World War II, the U.S. armies weren't cotton, but it's very. Eventually, they have better techniques to make cotton cloth to make them better. So, soon he's going to be dubbed Little Napoleon. Now, this fits in. He was relatively short of stature, and Napoleon was not that short, but that kind of fit in with that myth that was already there. And eventually, Little Mac would be given overall command, and Scott would be sent home. Lincoln had so much, he was so overwhelmed by these grand parades. I mean, he just couldn't get over, wow, look at this army. Here he is in Harper's Magazine as the great leader. And McClellan, in fact, McClellan was very confident. He said, I could do it all. I could become dictator if I wanted, but I don't want to do that. That should be a little scary for the guy with 100,000 men around Washington, D.C. And then nothing happened. Going into fall, nothing happened. McClellan, now in overall command, didn't do anything. Lincoln is like, okay, you have the army. The snows haven't hit. Attack. October, attack. He did nothing. In fact, he became convinced that he was outnumbered 2 or 3 to 1. It's not even possible. It can't be possible. Here's a jokey shot of McClellan facing off against Beauregard, who by then had already been fired because Johnson hated him. Here's Lincoln trying to lead him like a baby carriage. This is a pro-McClellan one, implying Lincoln are like a bunch of geese squawking at him to move. And McClellan believed, if they force me to move and I'm not ready, I'll destroy the Union. I'm outnumbered 4 to 1. He refused to move. Therefore, the winter hit, and going in 1862, got a fight. Or going in 1862, nothing was really happening, and this would become the key year. This is the most important year, arguably, in American history, 1862. Because to the north, the United States, it's still a fight about union. And so if they win the war in 1862, they're not going to have the issue of slavery resolved. And therefore, this year, if they could win it here, we'd have an entirely different course of history. Who knows? And the thought was, still, take Richmond, destroy the Confederate Army, we can win the war. And also, they did begin the blockade. The United States began building ships, wooden vessels with steam engines, and they still had masts and sails too for additional help as quickly as possible. Yes. Yeah, let's see. Or in a huddle in a tent outside of Washington, D.C. or in the Confederate lines too. But yeah, you're right at sea, rough seas. And with delicious food, crackers, hardtack, and boll weevils. Okay, you know what a boll weevil is? They're little bugs that get into meat. Okay, moving on. No, they're not purposely evil. Well, they begin to actually attack Confederate harbors and port cities to try to blockade them. Like, for example, they would attack New Bern, North Carolina, a big port there. Savannah and Charleston, they would attack on the outskirts of it. Maybe even New Orleans, but that's another story. To the south. So the south, King Cotton diplomacy failed. And going in 1862, they tried to trade, but now they had to run the blockade. And every year, the blockade is going to get stronger. And their basic strategy, hold out. Remember the United States strategy in the Revolutionary War. Eventually, the North would just go home. Hold out. The problem with holding out is they wanted Britain in the war too, knowing that if Britain intervenes with their powerful navy, the South will win. The problem is, for the Confederates, they remember the Revolutionary War.
It took a victory at Saratoga to bring the French in. And a lot of Confederates are thinking, do we hold out and just not lose the army and let the Union bleed itself to death? Or do we win a big victory? This, really hard, this will show that North won Southerners were two Northerners, we'll rout them. Holding out, though, nearly won the war. They were within a month of victory in 1864. And if they would have adopted this earlier, they very well could have won, and the US, as we know it, would not have won. It would be over. It was that close. I'll get to it next week. We're gonna go with something else. We'll go to the Vietnam War, and then we'll come back. So they talk about different sections, and this would be fully personified in World War I. They call it a theater. They started calling it here. This weird ways we're watching the battle in the newspapers. It was like a theater, and that's where it came from. But the Eastern Theater is basically here. Just this area around Richmond. The West is like everything else. This is all the West. I know, don't worry about directions, just go with it. And there'll be other theaters, like the Trans-Mississippi Theater. There's even a Far West Theater. There'll be fighting in New Mexico. But the Confederate forces were right here. They advanced up here and dug trenches along the Potomac. So not allowing the Union to use the Potomac River. It's a wide river. They had to do everything by rail. Precarious. They felt under siege, even though it wasn't total. And the Confederates built trenches along the Potomac, bristling with cannon and men. McClellan is there in command in 1862, and Lincoln is pushing. And for 4 months, McClellan refuses to listen to him. And more McClellan is thinking Lincoln's an idiot. He does not understand that the entire weight of the world is on my shoulders. The United States is over. And Lincoln is exasperated. Finally, Lincoln fires him from overall command. No, McClellan will remain command of the Army of the Potomac, but not overall command. And who took over? Lincoln. Anybody know how much formal training Lincoln had in military affairs of an army now with 300,000 men? Not any. This will be a disaster. Lincoln's very intelligent, but would make a number of bad decisions. And eventually he would kind of fire himself and appoint a commander in the next year. Speaking of World War II, Hitler would do that in 1942. He would take overall command. And for, I don't know your personal opinion, I despise fascism and Nazis. I think that was a good decision because Nixon turned out to be an inept. Did I say Nixon?
Yeah.
I think it's Nixon. Hitler was an inept leader, yeah. Huh? Quick go. No, go away, I quick go. All right. So with that, the Confederate commander was Joseph E. Johnston, maybe the best defensive commander of the war. The men adored him. I don't think there's a more popular commander on either side than Joseph E. Johnston. He was a Virginian. He knew how to defend. He too was very cautious. So we had McClellan, who's convinced he's outnumbered and cautious, and Johnston, who knew he was outnumbered. McClellan had over 100,000 men around Washington, D.C. Johnston had about 50,000. He could call in another few thousand, but he knows he's outnumbered. So with that, there's the Confederate flag. Remember the Confederate flag? And this was a problem. So Beauregard, before he was fired and sent to the West, he would invent a new flag. Red, white, and blue, slightly different shade of red, but using a diagonal cross so you can see it in a distance. This is not the flag of the Confederacy. This is the Confederate battle flag. Now, eventually, the Confederacy in the last year would adopt a white field with that in the corner. But that was never the Confederate flag. But you can see how that would work as a battle flag, because you could tell with a cross, it's not the US flag. You also see something else. By then, most flags copy Navy ensigns would be big and broad. So the big rectangle. You notice it's a square? It was so short of fabric. Remember you mentioned about textiles? They made their flag square because it saved a third of the fabric. So throughout the war, the Confederate flags would be just a square. That gives you an idea how short of supplies they were. One more thing, after the war, this will become a powerful symbol to try to justify the Confederates' secession, called the Lost Cause. that they were fighting a noble cause for freedom, and had nothing to do with slavery. And in the 1950s and 60s, that will become a symbol of being opposed to equal rights. And so people who wave the Confederate flag now, whatever their reason is, it has powerful symbolism, especially to people who were deprived of these rights in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So, McClellan didn't know how big the Confederate Army was, but he thought he was smarter than everybody else. So he decided, hey, I know what I'll do. There's this new group of people called private detectives, and one group called the Pinkertons. And they were used, they claim they could solve crimes, but the big thing is they would be guards on railroads and also to break up labor unions, so they wouldn't have to pay workers pay. They would infiltrate unions. They're basically thugs. They would also beat up members of unions. But McClellan had hired them before the war and thought, I'll get these guys to go spy behind the Confederate lines. So he got a bunch of guys, most of them had no idea about the military. They put them on horses and had them ride around Northern Virginia. Here's a few of them in Union camp to go gather intelligence on the Confederate Army. But before we get to that, do you like their slogan? We never sleep, implying that we will guard your trains. What term for private detective will come out of that picture? That's what private eye. Have you ever heard of that? Came from that picture, the creepy eye. Well, what if they went around the North, or they went around the Confederate armies, and they found out one thing. They had no idea what they were doing. And a bunch of guys with northern accents were walking around Northern Virginia saying, hi, how big is your army? And what did the Confederates tell them? But they could have executed them for spying, but what did they tell them? We have over 200,000 men. We have more men than we know what to do with. And the Pinkertons had no idea. If they would have known, they realized they don't have enough camps for that many men. They went north and told McClellan. What did McClellan think? I knew it! Lincoln is trying to get the country destroyed. He's an idiot. But I have a big army. And so the Pinkertons would be synonymous with disastrous information. And so with that, McClellan came up with a plan. Oh, we're jumping right to here. Here are Confederate forces. I can't attack them here because I'll get slaughtered, but I am so brilliant. I will fake an attack here, and then swing around and attack this way with using the Navy to land on the East Coast. But before they could do that, Johnston pulled back to here. And so abandoned these lines, trenches, rippling with guns. And when Union forces got there, this is what they found. This is a real picture from the Confederate lines taken at the end of February, 1862. Look at the Confederate guns. What are they? They're logs. In fact, they would paint them black. Here's a Union soldier acting like he's lighting one of them. Union soldiers would call these Quaker guns. And here's a Quaker gun. And because Quakers are what? Pacifists. Now, if you found the Confederate line and you thought they were strong and instead their guns were made of wood, what would your first response be? The Confederates are what? Weaker. What did McClellan believe? This proves they're strong and trying to suck me in. Once again, Lincoln is just going like this. Lincoln's scared to fire him, but he's now thinking about it. But then finally McClellan moved, and that is going to be called the Peninsular Campaign. And this is a battle. They went around to the James Peninsula at that Fort Monroe, but waiting there was a Confederate ship they built on a U.S. ship that the U.S. Navy abandoned called the Merrimack. And the Merrimack they covered with iron plates, the first ironclad they're called. Cannonballs could not penetrate the iron. Union spies had heard about it, so the Union was ready. But the first time the Merrimack went out, it sunk 2 Union ships in less than half an hour. The only reason it didn't sink more is the engine was so bad, and that the engine broke, and the interior of the Merrimack, and this is what it looked like. Side slanted with guns on the port and starboard side. It filled with smoke, and the men started passing out because of carbon monoxide. Oh, and it was also leaking water and about ready to sink. But no one could sink it. And we're coming to one of the most important naval battles in world history. Because the Union made a gunboat too. Have you heard about it? Called the Monitor. And on that one, we'll quit. Tomorrow we'll finish this, get to the biggie, the Battle of Antietam, which will change everything.